Welcome to the Appalachian Historical Review. This is the audio home for AppalachianGenealogy.com. Each week, we dig into the records, migration paths, and the real stories of the people who settled the Appalachian Range. We're here to look at the actual documents and the everyday lives that define our heritage. Let's step into the records and look at what the documents themselves reveal.
So, it's late summer, 1916, and I want you to imagine you're standing outside a one-room rural schoolhouse somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains.
Right.
The air is just thick, it's humid and completely still. The heavy rope used to ring the school bell is just hanging there, totally untouched.
Which is really eerie for September.
Exactly. The windows, which normally would be thrown wide open to catch a cross breeze, are latched tight. And if you peer through the glass, you see a county census book sitting open on the teacher's wooden desk.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a conspicuous blank space.
Mm-hmm.
A child's name is missing, right where it should have been perfectly recorded in cursive ink.
And, that blank space isn't a drop of spilled ink. It certainly isn't a clerical error.
Right.
It is a very deliberate, silent, historical marker. When we look at documents from this specific era, we are often looking at the architecture of a panic.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today in this deep dive. On the table between us is a massive stack of sources, historical state health reports, excerpts from local Appalachian newspapers.
Some really incredibly intimate personal diaries, too.
Yeah, church session minutes and modern genealogical methodology handbooks. We are synthesizing all of this material to understand the devastating 1916 polio epidemic.
Right.
But more importantly, our mission today is to teach you how to read those quiet spaces in 1916 Appalachian records with sharper, historically grounded eyes.
Yeah, because the central thesis we are working with here is that the 1916 polio wave left behind a very specific trail of subtle distortions.
Distortions in the paperwork, you mean?
Exactly. We're talking about delayed school terms, suspended church gatherings, and children who just simply vanish from the documentation without any explanation at all.
Which is terrifying for a genealogist.
It really is. And if you don't understand the mechanical, on-the-ground context of those silences, you can easily be led toward completely false conclusions about the people you are researching.
You might assume, your ancestors experienced family abandonment or some bitter internal conflict.
Or sudden out-migration, yeah. But the truth actually lies in public health and community-level caution.
So whether you are an active genealogist who has been banging your head against a brick wall trying to find a missing ancestor from the 1910s, or you're just a curious learner fascinated by how history hides in the margins, this really changes the way you look at the past.
It really does.
So let's start with the physical reality of the threat. The sources point out that this epidemic was originally centered in the Northeast. New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania were the epicenters.
Yeah, they were logging over 27,000 reported cases.
Wow.
And roughly 8,000 deaths nationwide that summer alone. It was massive.
That is just a staggering number for 1916. So to understand how those 27,000 cases in urban centers eventually impacted an isolated mountain holler, we really have to look at the medical context of the time.
Right, because physicians at the time understood they were dealing with a viral disease, but they lacked the critical piece of the puzzle.
Which was what?
Fecal-oral transmission. They had absolutely no concept that polio primarily spreads through the digestive tract and human waste.
Oh, wow. Which means they were fighting a war blindfolded, basically.
Totally blindfolded.
Reading through the public health mandates of the time, the theories were just all over the map. They blamed flies.
Yeah.
They blamed bad air or miasma creeping out of the swamps. They even blamed immigrant neighborhoods, which really leaned heavily into the xenophobia of the era to explain away a biological mechanism they didn't understand.
And, without knowing about the water table, blaming bad air or dirty neighborhoods actually makes complete logical sense to a 1916 health inspector.
I guess that's true, yeah.
If you think about the sanitation infrastructure of rural and semi-urban America at that time, you have outhouses sitting on slopes.
Right.
You have heavy summer rainstorms washing the drainage from those outhouses directly down into the spring houses.
Oh, yuck.
Yeah, or the shallow wells where communities draw their drinking water.
And then you have the communal dipper at the local schoolhouse.
Exactly. Or the shared water bucket in a coal mine. They were the perfect transmission vehicles.
So because they didn't understand this mechanism, the public health response was entirely focused on the wrong things.
Completely. You had strict quarantines, you had the establishment of isolation hospitals, and you had severe travel restrictions placed specifically on children.
But since they weren't addressing the water supply or sanitation, the virus just kept moving.
Right, and it drifted southward. But here is where the geography of Appalachia acts as a massive double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, on one hand, the extreme natural isolation of the region, the deep hollers, and the remote ridgetop communities genuinely protected some populations.
Because they were just so hard to get to.
Exactly. If you live 10 miles up a dirt road that is impassable by anything other than a mule, the virus simply cannot physically reach you in the early waves.
It couldn't reach them in June or July. But Appalachia was not a hermetically sealed bubble, right? I mean, the region's economy was rapidly industrialized.
Very rapidly, yes.
You have to picture the massive railroad corridors being blasted through the mountains, the river valleys acting as highways, and the booming coal and timber camps.
And these industrial sites required a massive influx of labor.
This is the mechanism of the spread, then. It wasn't just a slow creep over the mountains. It was a rapid transit system.
Yeah. The regional economy relied heavily on seasonal migration. You had young Appalachian men traveling.
And getting exposed to the larger urban outbreaks.
Right, and then taking the train back home. Think about the physical journey of a worker taking the Louisville and Nashville Railroad back into eastern Kentucky.
Okay.
He boards a train in a major hub that is currently experiencing a polio outbreak. He might be an asymptomatic carrier.
Oh, sure.
Over the course of a 2-day journey, that train stops at 20 different small depot towns. At each stop, he uses the station facilities. He buys food from a local vendor.
The virus is basically deposited along the economic arteries of the mountains.
Exactly. Long before a single child ever exhibits the symptoms of paralysis.
And because the vast majority of polio infections only result in mild, flu-like symptoms, and only a tiny percentage actually result in paralysis, these infections left zero obvious medical record initially.
None at all.
But they absolutely primed the pump for the community panic that would follow.
And the panic is the crucial element for a researcher to understand. It altered the records long before the virus itself did.
How does that work?
Well, a county might officially report 0 cases to the State Board of Health, but the local records will still show the massive disruptive scars of the epidemic because the fear of the sickness fundamentally changed how people moved.
How they gathered, how they documented their daily lives.
Exactly.
To really put you in the shoes of someone living through this creeping dread, I want to share a piece of historical narrative from our sources.
Oh yeah, this is a great one.
This is a verbatim historical newspaper excerpt designed to transport you straight back to that anxious summer. So this is from the Laurel Valley Sentinel, August 28, 1916. Quote, "Families across the Laurel Valley have taken to keeping their children close to home as word of the paralysis sickness continues to circulate from the northern counties."
So they already know it's coming?
Yeah. Though no official cases have been reported within our own borders, the Board of Health advises prudence, noting that several families in the river districts have written to the Sentinel expressing concern over travelers arriving by rail.
There's that railroad connection again.
Exactly. One mother from the Elk Ridge settlement reported that she has kept her children from the late summer singing school, saying she would rather bear their disappointment than risk the unknown.
Whoa.
Merchants along Main Street say business has slowed, particularly among families with young children. A school census taker told this paper that he has postponed his rounds until he receives further instruction from the superintendent.
Pay attention to that line right there.
Rumor suggests that the fall term may be delayed if the situation worsens. In the eastern timber camps, a child was said to have taken ill with sudden fever and weakness of the limbs.
It's starting.
The family has remained in their cabin, and neighbors have left food at the door. The doctor from town has not confirmed the nature of the illness, but the community remains uneasy. Folks recall the troubling reports from Pennsylvania earlier this summer and fear that the same affliction may find its way into these hills before the season turns. Unquote.
The detail we really need to focus on there is the school census taker postponing his rounds.
Yeah, that stood out to me too.
This is the exact moment an administrative distortion is born. The very person responsible for creating the official genealogical records you rely on today is actively choosing not to go out into the community.
He's looking at the rumors, looking at the timber camp and saying, "I'm staying home."
Right. And notice the phrase, "though no official cases have been reported." This is why state health aggregates are dangerously misleading for this era.
Because normal life in the Laurel Valley is grinding to an absolute halt. The singing school is skipped, merchants are losing revenue, and neighbors are leaving food on porches.
All based on a threat that technically, according to the state capitol, doesn't exist there yet.
Which brings us to the cultural response of the families actually living in those timber camps and ridge settlements. When the threat is invisible, and the public health authorities are miles away in a county seat you only visit maybe twice a year, how do you defend your family?
You rely on what you know, which means turning inward. In 1916 Appalachia, there was an intense and frankly historically justified distrust of hospitals and outside authorities.
Yeah, we have to separate our modern concept of a hospital from the 1916 reality.
Absolutely. An isolation ward during a polio outbreak wasn't a place of transparent, compassionate medical care. It was essentially a medical jail.
If a public health officer came up the mountain and found a paralyzed child, that child was removed. The parents weren't allowed to go with them.
No, they couldn't visit at all.
The child was placed in a crowded ward with dozens of other highly infectious patients, often receiving experimental or downright harmful treatments.
Families were terrified that if their child went into the town hospital, they would simply never see them again. So the logical protective response was to hide the illness. There was a heavy reliance on home care, traditional folk remedies, and incredibly tight kin networks. You saw it in the newspaper excerpt. The community enforces its own quarantine by leaving food at the door.
They sort of circle the wagons. And because they handle it internally, these cases never enter the formal medical register.
Never.
There is another defensive behavior mentioned in the sources that creates absolute chaos in the paper trail. Parents were actively leveraging the mountain geography to protect their children by setting them up on the ridge.
Yes, it was a very common strategy. If you lived down in the river valley near the railroad tracks, which everyone correctly identified as the danger zone.
Yeah, because of the travelers.
Right, you would pack your children up and send them to live with an aunt, a grandfather, or a cousin in a much more remote, higher elevation settlement.
Think about the mechanical result of that action on the historical record.
Mm-hmm.
If a mother sends her 8-year-old son to his uncle's farm in mid-August of 1916, and the postponed school census is finally taken in late September.
That child is physically missing from his home district.
Exactly. A genealogist looking at that ledger a century later might assume the child died or the family fractured.
When it is actually just a temporary, fear-based relocation, the child might reappear in the records 2 years later, completely healthy, leaving the researcher utterly baffled as to where they were in 1916.
I want to share another piece from our sources to really ground this in the emotional reality of a parent making those decisions. This is an intimate, first-hand perspective from a personal diary.
These diaries are so vital to understanding the history.
They really are. So, quote, Diary of Mary Ellen Crouch, Upper Caney Fork, September 1916.
Right.
The children have stayed close to the house these past 2 weeks. Word came from over the ridge that a little boy took sick and could not move his legs by morning.
Which is terrifying.
Folks say it's the same sickness that has been in the northern counties. I have kept our young ones from the singing school, even though they begged to go. It does not sit right with me to risk it.
She's trusting her gut.
Yeah. Tom rode to town yesterday for flour and said the square was near empty. The school board has not said whether the term will start on time. I hope they wait. I do not want the children crowded together until we know more.
The uncertainty is palpable.
Our neighbor's boy, Henry, has been poorly since last Sunday. His mother says he had a fever and now seems weak on one side. They have not called the doctor yet. Folks here do not trust the hospital in town. They say once a child goes in, you may not see them again for weeks.
There's that fear of the isolation wards.
I pray this trouble passes us by. The hills feel quiet in a way that troubles me. Even the dogs seem to bark less at night. Unquote.
Wow. Just the atmosphere of that. Even the dogs seem to bark less at night.
It's so eerie. But wait, I need to challenge the logic of this methodology right here.
Okay, go for it.
We are talking about tracking these people through historical documents. But she literally says they have not called the doctor yet. Folks here do not trust the hospital in town. If a family actively refuses to call the doctor and they are hiding the sickness from the state out of sheer terror of the isolation wards, how can we possibly find them?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like earlier you mentioned, we can use proxy records like coffin receipts. But if they are hiding the illness from the state, aren't they also hiding it from the local undertaker? Wouldn't a sudden spike in child coffins alert the very authorities they are trying to avoid?
It's an excellent question, and it gets to the heart of how rural infrastructure actually functioned in 1916. You have to understand that the local undertaker or the carpenter who built the coffins was not an agent of the state.
Okay.
He wasn't a government employee reporting to the county health board. He was a neighbor. He was the guy who owned the sawmill or the local furniture store.
Oh, I see. So paying him for a pine box doesn't trigger a government investigation.
Exactly the opposite. It was a private, deeply localized transaction. The state health department in the capital city never sees the carpenter's ledger.
Right, because it's just a business receipt.
Yeah. The only time the government gets involved is years later during the probate process when an estate has to settle its historical debts. So the family isn't hiding the death from their community, they are hiding the contagious nature of the illness from the urban authorities.
Which means the local records, the church books, the general store ledgers, the probate files are the only places where the truth survives.
Precisely.
But if we are digging into those specific local records, we have to know exactly what words to look for. If I go into a county archive and type polio into a digital index or scan a handwritten ledger for that specific word, I'm going to come up totally empty-handed, right?
Oh, completely empty-handed. You cannot impose 21st century medical terminology on a 20th century rural document.
Because they just didn't use that word.
Yes, exactly. The word poliomyelitis might appear in a sophisticated state medical journal, but it is not what the local circuit-riding preacher is writing in his notebook. You have to listen for the local speech.
So what should we be looking for?
You need to look for phrases like infantile paralysis or childhood paralysis.
And the terminology gets even less formal than that, doesn't it? I noticed in the research that family lore or informal letters often just describe someone as crippled, or they might write that a child took with the paralysis or never walked right after that summer sickness.
Yes. Furthermore, you have to account for phonetic spelling. The people keeping these local records were often semi-literate clerks or volunteers.
Right, they're just spelling it how it sounds to them.
You might find paralysis spelled with a U, or two R's, or starting with a PER. Your search strategies have to be wildly flexible.
That flexibility is crucial because, as the sources emphasize, the official county records are just a mess. County reporting during this era was incredibly uneven.
The mechanism of that unevenness is really fascinating. During a panic, many rural counties couldn't rely on their single overwhelmed health officer, so they deputized temporary volunteer health officers.
And who were these people?
These were just prominent local citizens, maybe a merchant or a school teacher, tasked with keeping a tally of the sick.
And how did they keep that tally? On the backs of envelopes.
Yeah.
On scrap paper in their pockets.
Which means those reports were almost never formally archived. When the panic subsided, the volunteer went back to their day job, and those scraps of paper were thrown in the stove.
Wow.
Combine that with the reality of courthouse fires, floods, and the routine purges of old documents that counties perform when they run out of storage space, and the civil record is frequently obliterated.
Even when the state records do survive intact,
Yeah.
the urban centers completely skew the data. A massive outbreak in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh generates so much paperwork that it completely overshadows the rural mountain areas in the state's aggregate data.
Right, the numbers are just completely swallowed up.
So if the county health records are gone, or they never existed in the first place, we have to look at the institutions that actually govern daily life.
And in 1916 Appalachia, the absolute center of daily governance and social cohesion was the church.
Let's look at exactly how a church record captures this data. I have an excerpt here from an alternative record source, and it perfectly illustrates how community ledgers act as civil registration proxies.
These are a goldmine.
Now, quote, Minutes of the Clear Fork Primitive Baptist Church, October 1916. The congregation met in regular order on the first Sabbath. Elder Lawson opened with prayer. The clerk reported that attendance had been light for several weeks, owing to the sickness said to be moving through nearby counties.
There's the behavioral change.
It was agreed that the children's gathering would remain suspended until further notice. Sister Hargis brought word of the passing of young Martha L., daughter of John and Rebecca L., who took ill in late August with what the doctor called paralysis.
Look at that terminology.
The family requested that the church remember them in prayer. The clerk recorded the child's name in the roll of deceased members' children. The deacons reported that funds from the benevolence basket were given to the L family to assist with burial expenses. No further business was brought before the body. The meeting adjourned in peace. Unquote.
The density of historical data packed into that single paragraph is astounding. We established earlier that civil registration for births and deaths was incredibly weak in these counties.
Yeah, almost non-existent.
A family living miles up a muddy ridge road in November isn't going to spend 2 days traveling to the county courthouse, paying a filing fee, and registering a death certificate. But they are absolutely going to report that death to their church congregation.
Let's break down the mechanics of what this church minute book actually gives a researcher. First, we get a highly specific timeline. The child took ill in late August, and the death is reported by October.
Right.
Second, we get a cause of death written in the local vernacular, what the doctor called paralysis.
Third, you have documentary proof of the community's behavioral response. The clerk explicitly notes that attendance has been light for weeks, and the children's gathering is formally suspended. This confirms the panic has physically altered the social structure of the town.
And fourth, we get economic proxy data. The deacons allocated funds from the benevolence basket to assist with burial expenses.
Which is huge.
It tells us the family was financially strained by the illness, perhaps due to the cost of that doctor's visit or the inability of the parents to work during the quarantine. You now have a date, a cause of death, a social context, and a financial snapshot, all from a non-governmental record.
This ripple effect of documentation touches every single facet of community life, well beyond the church. If we look at the educational system, school records act as a primary indicator of epidemic disruption.
Right, because it wasn't just that the school boards, meeting down in the county seat, formally postponed the fall terms.
The more revealing details are found in the informal records kept by the teachers themselves. Consider how a rural school operated. A teacher's pay was sometimes tied to the attendance of her pupils.
Oh, interesting.
She kept a meticulous personal daybook. In the margins of that daybook, she would note who was absent, who had been sent away to live with relatives, or who was out with the fever.
So if you are tracking a specific family and you see a child present every single day in the 1915 ledger, but their name is entirely missing from the 1916 ledger, that is a glaring red flag that warrants further investigation.
Exactly.
Now, we focused heavily on children because infantile paralysis predominantly affected the young, but it absolutely struck adults as well. And the documentary ripple effect for an adult contracting the virus in an industrial setting is entirely different.
It's a completely different paper trail. Imagine a 22-year-old wage earner working in an eastern Kentucky coal camp. He contracts polio.
Okay.
He survives the acute viral phase, but the disease leaves him with partial paralysis in his legs.
In a coal camp, if you can't physically swing a pickaxe or load a cart, your entire existence is upended.
The mechanics of the company town are brutal. You live in a company-owned house, and you buy your food at the company-owned store using company script.
Right.
The moment that 22-year-old can no longer perform heavy physical labor, he is evicted from the company housing. He vanishes from the company payroll ledgers. He is struck from the occupational tax rolls.
So to a genealogist tracing his name through the county tax documents, it looks like he just packed up and moved to another state, or simply dropped off the face of the earth.
But he didn't move to another state. He was suddenly and permanently disabled. The tragedy of the situation is where that young man eventually reappears in the historical record.
Where do we find him?
If you jump forward 5 or 10 years, you might find him listed in the ledger of a county almshouse or a rural poor farm. And in the column for cause of indigence, the clerk has written, crippled from infantile paralysis.
Wow, that is incredibly sad.
The economic devastation for a working adult in 1916 contracting this disease was absolute, and it fundamentally altered their trajectory in the public record.
Let's go back to the mechanism of death records.
Yeah.
We established that civil death certificates are rare for this demographic. If a child dies and we want to find proxy records for that death outside of the church, you mentioned estate packets earlier.
Yes.
I think we need to explain exactly how an estate packet works and why a child's death would be inside a parent's file.
Sure. An estate packet or a probate file is essentially a collection of loose papers generated when a person dies and their earthly debts have to be settled by the local court. The court appoints an executor, usually the widow or the eldest son.
And it's the executor's job to gather every single outstanding bill the deceased person owed and pay it out of whatever money or property the estate has left.
The executor literally carries these physical receipts to the county courthouse, where the clerk ties them together in a ribbon-bound bundle. If you pull the estate packet of a man who died in 1920, you might find a ledger of debts stretching back years. You are looking for a crumpled bill from a country doctor dated late summer 1916, charging for attendance on child. Or a receipt from the local mercantile store for medicines and liniment.
Or, most heartbreakingly, the carpenter's bill. A physical receipt submitted to the estate for the cost of pine boards and nails used to construct a child-sized box in September 1916.
Yeah.
That single slip of paper might be the only surviving legal proof that the child ever existed and died.
The physical landscape itself holds these proxy records as well. Our sources note the haunting visual of child burials in family cemeteries. Because of the sheer panic of the epidemic, the need for rapid burial to prevent contagion, and the severe lack of funds, many of these graves were not marked with professionally carved granite headstones.
They used field stones. Just a rough rock pulled from the creek bed or the edge of the pasture. Sometimes a grieving parent would take a chisel and scratch an initial antennae of the year 1916 into the rock.
When you walk a rural ridgetop cemetery and you see a cluster of those 1916 field stones within a single-family plot or scattered across neighboring plots, you are no longer just looking at a graveyard. You are standing in the physical footprint of the epidemic.
To show you exactly how this methodology solves complex historical mysteries, we have a specialized mini-case study derived directly from our sources. We're going to put all of this theory into practice and walk through it step by step. Let me introduce you to the McClure family of Eastern Kentucky.
The McClures are a textbook example of reading the silences in the historical record.
Here is the mystery, as it initially presents itself to a researcher. You pull the 1915 county school census. You see 3 children listed in the McClure household: Nora, age 10, Samuel, age 8, and Ruth, age 6.
Everything looks perfectly normal.
Exactly. Then you pull the 1916 school register. Samuel is gone. Only Nora and Ruth are listed. There is no marginal note beside his name explaining his absence.
So your next logical step is to check the county property tax rolls to see if the family moved to a different district. But the tax rolls confirm the McClures are still paying taxes on the exact same acreage. They haven't relocated.
So you check the civil death register for the county. You search for Samuel McClure, 1916. 0 results. No death certificate was ever filed. What happened to this 8-year-old boy?
Right, he didn't run away from home.
He wasn't sent to an orphanage because the county court minutes show no record of wardship.
This is the moment you have to triangulate the sources, utilizing the local speech, the proxy records, and the understanding of community panic. Let's walk through the methodology.
Okay, let's do it.
Step 1. You check the community proxy records. You locate the minute book for the local Baptist church the McClures attended. The entry for September 1916 explicitly mentions that regular services were suspended due to paralysis in the community. You have now established the local presence of the disease at the exact moment Samuel disappears from the school roll.
Wow. Step 2. You investigate the physical landscape. You secure permission to visit the old McClure family cemetery on their original farm property. Next to the later, professionally carved stones of the parents, you find a small, rough-hewn field stone.
Yeah.
It doesn't bear the name Samuel McClure. It just has crude letters scratched into it. SM 1916.
Step 3. You expand the search outward to the neighbors. Remember, an epidemic is a community-wide event. You go back to the courthouse and pull the estate packet for a neighboring farmer who died that fall.
Okay, so checking the neighbors' records.
Right. Inside his probate file, tied up in that ribbon, is a doctor's bill referencing treatment for a paralyzed child in that neighbor's household during August of 1916. This absolutely confirms the virus was active and causing paralysis on that specific ridge.
Step 4. You consult the regional news. The local county paper reports that families in the McClure's specific school district were actively keeping their children home due to fear of the paralysis sickness.
When you assemble those disparate pieces, the missing school record, the suspended church services, the initialed field stone, the neighbor's medical bill, and the newspaper report documenting the panic, the conclusion becomes historically undeniable.
Samuel didn't vanish into thin air. He died in the 1916 polio wave, and the chaos of the epidemic masked his passing.
The emotional payoff of applying this methodology is profound. You are taking a cold, confusing disappearance in a dusty ledger book, and you are transforming it into a deeply human, historically grounded family narrative. You are giving Samuel McClure his history back.
That is the ultimate goal of this work. Historical and genealogical research is not an exercise in collecting names and dates like stamps. It is the pursuit of understanding the lived experiences of these people. Honoring their experience frequently means learning to understand the context of their silence.
Beautifully said.
Before we send you off to dive into your own family sources with these new tools, we need to provide a troubleshooting guide. This specific type of research requires immense nuance. And there are major pitfalls that researchers frequently fall into when dealing with 1916 records. We have 4 common pitfalls and the corrections for each. Let's tackle pitfall number 1, assuming scandal.
This happens all the time. A researcher sees a child suddenly disappear from a census record, or they see a young mother suddenly living back home with her parents, and they immediately project a modern narrative onto the data.
They assume illegitimacy, abandonment, or a bitter family conflict.
The correction here is simple but vital. You must check the broader historical context of the year before, assuming the worst about an ancestor's character. If a massive social disruption occurs in your family tree in the late summer or fall of 1916, polio is a highly probable explanation.
Don't assume your great-grandfather was a deadbeat who abandoned his wife and children, when the reality might be that he was a paralyzed 20-year-old timber worker who lost his company housing and was sent to a county home.
Exactly. Pitfall number 2 is the rigid belief that no record means no event.
We've hammered this point thoroughly today, but it is the biggest hurdle. In early 20th century Appalachia, serious illness and death frequently went entirely unrecorded in civil government systems.
The correction is to aggressively broaden your search parameters. You must check the church minutes, the local undertaker's ledgers, the general store charge accounts, and the probate estate packets. Silence in the government record does not equate to silence in reality.
Pitfall number 3, missing the local speech. You cannot search these archives using modern medical terms.
The correction is to adapt your vocabulary. Stop typing polio into search bars. Start looking for paralysis, infantile paralysis, crippled, brain fever, or childhood sickness. You must read the documents with an ear tuned to how your ancestors actually spoke to one another.
And finally, pitfall number 4, treating counties as islands. Genealogists often get severe tunnel vision. They only look at the specific county borders where their ancestor lived, ignoring everything happening 5 miles away across the county line.
Diseases do not respect jurisdictional boundaries. I like to think of it like observing the gravitational pull of an invisible planet by watching how the other stars move around it.
I love that analogy.
You might not be able to see the virus in your specific county's records, but if you look at the neighboring county, you can see the panic bending the community's behavior.
It's like trying to understand a flood by only looking at a puddle in your driveway. You have to look at the weather reports for the whole region.
Right.
The correction is to pull back and look at the state health reports, the regional newspapers, and the neighboring counties. A wave of infection might have moved along a railroad line that barely clips the very edge of your ancestor's county, but the rumors and the panic spread outward for 50 miles.
Corroborating your findings across multiple record types and across regional boundaries is the only way to build a solid, defensible historical conclusion.
To summarize our deep dive today, the 1916 polio waves was not just a catastrophic medical event, it was a documentary event. It fundamentally reshaped Appalachian records in subtle, easily missed ways.
Learning to read those silences, the skipped school terms, the quiet church houses, the missing names, is how we uncover the truth. It requires a complete shift in perspective. You have to stop looking only for what is explicitly written on the page and start looking for the shape of what is missing.
Here is our call to action for you. Pull out your own genealogical research. Dust off those family group sheets and those brick wall ancestors you haven't looked at in a while. Go back and revisit the school registers, the church rolls, and the family cemeteries.
Look at the years 1916 and 1917 with a sharper, more informed eye.
Look for the patterns of disruption we've discussed today. You might just solve a mystery you've been stuck on for a decade.
Keep in mind the physical environment those records were created in.
I want to bring us back to that auditory image from the very start of the show. Imagine the sound of that quiet schoolyard in late September. The breeze rustling the pages of an open census book. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important clues, the deepest tragedies, and the most profound acts of community love are the ones that never made it into the official ink.
Before we go, there is one final provocative thought to mull over something we haven't explicitly touched on yet.
Oh, what's that?
Consider the survivors. For every child like Samuel McClure who tragically vanished from a record, there were young adults who survived the 1916 wave. But they survived changed. They carried the invisible, long-term economic and physical impacts of that virus for decades.
You're talking about post-polio syndrome, the chronic fatigue, the muscle weakness that comes back years later?
Yes, and the subtle, forced occupational shifts. Their silences weren't just in the paperwork, they were carried in their physical bodies. This shaped their occupations, their marriages, and their daily routines. Think about it. How many quiet, lifelong struggles are hiding in plain sight in your own family tree, masked as a sudden career change from heavy farming to store clerking, or an oddly early retirement at age 40? The echo of 1916 didn't stop in 1917. It lasted a lifetime.
What an incredibly powerful thought to end on. It completely changes how you view the entire trajectory of a person's life. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the past, for unpacking the silences with us, and for learning how to listen to the quiet spaces of history. Keep digging, keep questioning, and we will catch you on the next one.
Thank you for listening to this installment of the Appalachian Historical Review. Remember to visit the digital archive at appalachiangenealogy.com. Join us next time for further study into the records and history of the Appalachian region.